The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, rising from the high terraces of Carthage. Yet mingled with it was something heavier, something that clung to the skin and made the breath feel weighted. From above the temple of Ba al Ḥammon, one could look down upon the gathering, a solemn procession of the city's elite, walking not in celebration nor in mourning, but in resignation. They did not come to honor the dead, but to offer them. In Carthage, devotion was not always symbolic, it demanded life itself. They called them gifts, but these were not tokens carved of stone or offerings of grain. Wrapped in linen or in the fine cloth of their noble houses, they were children, sometimes the most noble, sometimes the most powerless, carried to the altars, not in reverence, but in surrender. The people believed their sacrifice was a bargain with the gods, a dreadful exchange meant to buy protection, victory, or favor. For Carthage, belief was sharper than any blade. At the heart of the temple stood the idol, a towering figure of Kronos, whom the Carthaginians named Ba al Ḥammon. Its outstretched bronze hands were no mere ornament. They were crafted with cruel purpose. Angled downward, they served as a passage, a bridge between the living world and the flames below. Each offering was placed upon those searing hands, and slowly, with dreadful certainty, slid into the brazier that roared beneath. This was not poetic devotion, it was fire made into faith. Ancient historian Plutarch wrote that mothers stood close, expected to remain silent, even as their children were taken. Not a cry, not a scream, not even the breaking of breath was permitted. And if sound did escape, the ritual did not falter, it proceeded as planned. Music filled the air, drums and pipes rising in dreadful chorus, not to honor the gods, but to drown the cries of the living. Even grief was silenced. What mattered most to the priests was not the mother's heart, but the appearance of willing piety. And this was not merely a tale told by Rome to vilify its rival. From Carthage itself comes proof. On a weathered stele carved in Punic script, one line reads, "To the Lady Tinnet Fenable and to the Lord Ba al Ḥammon, Genmai vowed his own flesh." For Carthaginians, this vow was not metaphor. It was literal, a declaration that flesh and blood were the rightful tribute to the gods. Their own words became the most chilling witness. Across Carthage lay the Tophet, a sacred ground, part shrine, part burial field. Excavations there have uncovered thousands of urns, filled with the remains of ritual offerings, infants, children, small animals. Layer upon layer, century upon century, the ashes of the sacrificed were gathered. To the Carthaginians, this was hallowed earth. To the eyes of today, it is a haunting record of devotion written in fire and bone. Closer to Carthage's own time, the historian Clitarchus described the moment when ritual fire met the offering. He claimed the victims' faces would twist, their expressions freezing into strange, tense smiles. To Carthaginian priests, this was a sign of acceptance, a signal that the gods had received, but to outsiders, it was something else entirely. The sight of innocence caught in fire, transformed into terror. As the flames roared and the sacrifices burned, the sound of drums shook the city's stone walls. Carthage's enemies heard them too. To some, it was the echo of horror. To others, it was a warning written in fire and smoke. This is how Carthage honors those it offers. This is how Carthage declares its power. Not through the sword, but through fear made into ritual. Beneath the shadow of Carthage's vast twin harbors, the sound of hammers and chisels echoed. To the outside world, these docks were a marvel engineered to host hundreds of ships, the arteries of an empire's wealth. But behind the grandeur lay a darker rhythm. The clang of metal was struck by enslaved hands. Men, women, and children captured in war filled the shipyards. Their backs bent beneath the whip, their sweat poured into the empire's veins. They were not Carthaginian citizens. They were enemies, seized, shackled, and transformed into tools of power. Carthage's wealth did not rise only from trade, it was built on human bondage. According to ancient accounts, slaves were pushed into every corner of the city. They hauled stone to raise the markets, they poured sweat into the foundations of plazas and wharves, they ground flour and pressed olives until their hands blistered. Each elegant floor of marble, each factory humming with work, bore the imprint of lives that would never profit from it. Slavery was not a byproduct of war. It was the machinery of empire itself. For many men, the sea became their prison. Captives taken in conquest were bound in chains and forced onto the warships of Carthage. Here, survival was not a mercy, it was a sentence. Chained to heavy oars, rowers bent forward in unison, their muscles screaming, the salt of sweat mixing with salt of sea. Each stroke was not for themselves, but for the glory of the city that had broken them. When Carthage triumphed in the Mediterranean, it was not only the work of admirals and generals, it was the labor of nameless slaves, pulling against their chains until the horizon bent. Nor were women or children spared. In the households of the wealthy, enslaved women ground grain from sunrise to dusk, their backs curved over stone mills. In the workshops, they spun wool or pressed olives, while children carried baskets of clay, oil, or pulp heavier than their years could bear. Outside the city, entire families were condemned to vineyards and granaries, where the sun burned mercilessly and overseers watched without pity. In Carthage, slavery was not a scar, it was a way of life, woven into the fabric of every street and field. Beyond the walls, the countryside bore its own burden. Rows of vineyards stretched across the fertile land, tended not by free farmers, but by the conquered. Under constant watch, they labored in the dust, pruning vines and hauling amphorae of wine back toward the city. In the granaries, sacks of grain were lifted until spines bent. The prosperity of Carthage flowed from these silent fields, where voices of the enslaved were drowned by the weight of toil. But not all captives were granted the mercy of labor. When rebellion struck, Carthage chose terror over toil. Polybius records one chilling account. Prisoners were brought before the people, and elephants, war beasts trained for conquest, were driven forward. The massive animals crushed flesh and bone as crowds looked on. This was not punishment. It was theater, a spectacle of fear meant to remind both slave and citizen that Carthage's power was absolute. If labor sustained the empire, terror secured it. Beyond Africa's coast, the story spread. Sailors in Mediterranean ports whispered of Carthage's wealth, but also of its cruelty. They spoke of shipyards filled with slaves, of vineyards worked by broken families, of elephants unleashed against captives. In these whispers, awe and fear mingled together. Carthage was not only a city of commerce, it was a warning written into every harbor, every market, every chain. The streets of Carthage were silent, but they were not empty. Torches burned in long rows, their flames casting sharp shadows across stone walls and waiting faces. At the center of the procession was a single man, Mathos, once a rebel commander, now broken and bound. He was dragged through the city not for judgment in a court, nor for a quiet execution behind walls, but for something far more deliberate. This was punishment as performance. The city gathered to watch him fall, and in their silence, Carthage spoke its message. When the procession reached its end, the man was not executed by a single hand. He was turned over to the people themselves. Surrounded by an angry mob, Mathos was torn apart in a storm of rage and vengeance. His death was not only retribution for rebellion, it was a public stage upon which the city declared its power. To defy Carthage was to be consumed by it, body and soul. Yet Carthage's vengeance did not stop with one man. After the mercenary war, 700 captured soldiers were gathered together. They were not given the death of warriors, nor the dignity of battle. Instead, they were subjected to ritualized punishment and then interred beneath the earth itself. In silence and shadow, the ground swallowed them. Carthage did not simply kill its enemies, it buried them, turning their very bodies into monuments of warning. Among the most enduring tales of Carthaginian cruelty is that of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general captured in war. According to Roman accounts, he was placed inside a wooden box lined with sharp spikes. He could not sit, nor lean, nor sleep. Day after day, he endured slow torment until death came. Whether this story was fact or Roman invention, it traveled far and wide. It was told in forums and classrooms, in taverns and barracks, painting Carthage as a civilization that wielded suffering as strategy. For Carthage, execution was never only about punishment. It was theater. It was meant to be seen, to echo across the city's streets, to carry whispers across the sea. Death was shaped into spectacle, cruelty carved into memory. Each act of terror was a message, not just to rebels and captives, but to rival empires. Carthage would not be defied. To resist was not only to lose, it was to suffer in ways that would be remembered. From sacrificial fires to chains and elephants, from the silence of mothers to the fury of crowds, Carthage had forged a weapon greater than swords or spears. It wielded fear itself. Fear to control its slaves. Fear to silence rebellion. Fear to warn its enemies across the sea. And though the city's walls were strong, its ships swift, and its markets rich, it was this fear that most defined its legacy. In Carthage, cruelty was not chaos, it was strategy. The legacy endured. Romans would later tell these stories to justify their wars. Historians would write them as warnings. Archaeologists would uncover the urns, the stelae, the bones of those offered to fire. And still, the question remains, did Carthage's brutal message secure its dominance or hasten its downfall? For in wielding fear, the city carved its own monument, not in stone, but in terror. And so, Carthage's story is not only one of ships and trade, of wealth and conquest, but of fear carefully shaped into power. From the fires of sacrifice to the silence of slaves, from the roar of elephants to the cries drowned by music, every act carried a message. To friends, to enemies, and to the gods themselves, Carthage declared, "Yield to us or be broken." Yet in the end, fear is a weapon that burns both hands. Rome would not forget, and neither would history. The ashes of Carthage's Tophet, the bones buried beneath its soil, and the legends whispered across the sea have carried its reputation for over 2,000 years. Some call them exaggerations, others undeniable truths. Yet what survives is the same, a memory of power sustained by terror. Carthage is gone, its walls fallen, its stones scattered, but its lessons remain. That cruelty can build an empire, yet cruelty can also dig its grave. As we leave these ancient streets behind, one question lingers. Did Carthage's brutal message secure its greatness or hasten its destruction? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence of its ruins. Tonight, let history's whispers guide your thoughts, and may the echoes of Carthage remind us how fragile power can be. Until tomorrow's journey into the past, good night.